If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. You can visit tutor2u.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, revision videos, flashcards, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so my guest for this episode is Dr. Monique Charles. Monique, hello, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes. Well, I'm, as it says on the tin, I'm Dr. Monique Charles, and I am a cultural sociologist. My research broadly is in the area of, I suppose, music and sound. My PhD, which I did at the University of Warwick, was on grime music, and I do a bit of sound therapy on the side, if you want to call it that. So I do sound therapy. I specialise in tuning forks. I think that kind of, I suppose, very generally is a whistle-stop tour. That's kind of what I do. Write about music from a cultural perspective, political, various different lenses, cultural, political, but spiritual lenses as well. Yeah, that kind of thing.
Fantastic. And where did sociology start for you, Monique?
Oh, it started, how long have you got? With the sociology, I've always kind of had a sociological brain, let's just put it that way. So one of the earliest, I suppose, sociological experiments I did, if you want to call it an experiment, was when I was, I think, about 7 or 8, and we learnt about factions at school. I was trying to use quarters to explain what my understanding of social inequality was at the time. So boys were treated better than girls, black people weren't treated as favourably as white people, and I'm in the quarter, the quarters that overlapped, so I've always kind of looked at the world and tried to make sense of it. And so this is just something that's just been, I've always kind of done in my mind. But then when I went to university, if we kind of fast forward all that way, I did psychology. I was interested in what made people tick. So I did psychology as my first degree, and with race and cultural studies, because race has always been something of interest to me. Then the master's was race and ethnic relations, although it looked at class and gender as well, largely. And I was just always interested in what made people tick. Always had a love for music, was an aspiring singer for a bit. Kind of coming out of retirement, I hope, with that now. And so I just wanted to kind of tie all of my interests together as much as possible for the PhD, and that's where I came up with Hallowed, Be Thy Grime. So I was looking at music spiritually, culturally, sociologically, and I was in the sociology department at Warwick as well, so I am a cultural sociologist. So yeah, it's just kind of been something I've always been interested in, and never necessarily knew the name was sociology.
Yeah. Because one of the things I always ask people, Monique, is kind of who are their inspirations within their field. And I suppose sociology and music is a little bit more niche, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is very niche. And I mean, for me, I'm the sort of person, I like ideas wherever they kind of come from. So when it comes to, I mean, Stuart Hall, I mean,
yeah,
you know, who wouldn't, you know? And obviously Gilroy is definitely up there as well. But then when I look overseas, when I'm looking at, I suppose, more musical stuff, Trisha Rose was a big influence for me. I don't know if she would necessarily consider herself a sociologist, but definitely her work, some of Cornel West's work, Michael Eric Dyson's work, because they were more about the music from an academic lens. But yeah, if I like an idea, I'll kind of take it on board and see how I can help it to make sense of my social world.
Yeah. And let's get into your own research then. So, could you mind giving us the title again of your work on grime? What was it?
Okay, so it's a long title. I'm trying to remember it now.
Okay.
So it's Hallowed Be Thy Grime, colon, because there's always a colon with these things. So Hallowed Be Thy Grime, a sociological and musicological genealogy of grime music and its relation to Black Atlantic religious discourse. So that's the full title.
That's impressive.
Yeah, so that's the title.
Great. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about it, how it all got started, and what the focus of the study is about?
Okay, right. So how I got started, I suppose it kind of, we're not going to go back to me being 7 or 8 again, but once I finished my first degree, I was doing a lot of the singing stuff. So I obviously had a love of music and everything else. And then when I wanted to do my master's, I already knew before I even started, I wanted to have a musical element whilst I was interested in race, hence the MSc in race and ethnic relations. When I was actually doing my dissertation, my master's dissertation or my master's thesis, I was looking at hip hop music and looking at the political economy of the music industry at the time, which was very different to now because we don't have, we didn't have streaming back then. This was in the mid-noughties when I was doing my master's. And I was looking at how artists, Black artists that were the most commercially successful at that particular point in time conformed most strongly to racial stereotypes. And around that time, again, in the mid-noughties, grime was kind of like bubbling up underneath, bubbling up under the surface, if you want to call it that. Politicians had something to say about the genre, saying it's making killing a fashion accessory and all sorts of things. And whilst I was doing my master's, I was thinking, I'm looking at hip hop. There's a whole body of scholarly work here. Politicians couldn't come out and say something like this for US artists, because academics would come out and show, good or bad, what contributions it's made to society, what kind of cultural norms there are, all sorts of things. And I thought, well, none of that is happening here in the UK. So I need to, when I finish this master's, I need to go on and do this PhD and look at grime and really try and capture what's going on. Because if it's bubbling up to the point where politicians have got something to say, young people clearly have something to say, and it needs to be explored and not ignored and demonized. So that is kind of what was one of my main driving forces, as well as the fact I wanted to explore spirituality in music, which I couldn't do in my master's thesis. So the thesis itself, I tried to do everything because I didn't know if anyone else was ever going to do anything on grime. So I developed a methodological framework through which to analyze what music is when you approach it culturally or socially, because many studies on music in sociology or in academic context tend to just look at the lyrics and not necessarily the sonics or the sounds. So through this process, I've developed a framework called MDA, or musicological discourse analysis. So I looked at music and its components and genre and all that sort of stuff. That was one chapter. Another chapter looked at the scene and how the scene spread. So looked at the role of technology, looked at the role of spaces, tried to make sense of, spaces, values, norms, and also censorship and, I suppose, authoritative interventions, police, government policy to a certain extent, how that helped to shape the scene, become what it was. I also looked at race, class, and gender in the scene. And I also looked at live performance, so I had to go raving for observation purposes, of course. But I had to, I went to live performance spaces to kind of get a sense of what was happening spiritually / emotionally / kind of in an embodied fashion. So I tried to cover it from as many angles as possible.
Did you ever think when you first started that grime would get as big as it is now? Was that ever conceivable?
Yes, I thought it would.
You were now, okay.
Yeah. And the reason why I thought it would was because when I think about Black music forms, which is the area I suppose I focus more often on, if we think about, almost every genre of music I can think of, so, rock and roll or blues, jazz, hip hop is a bit different, but those particular genres of music, they were demonized, whether it's their devil music, the, demon sort of stuff, or it was considered, in the ghettos or the inner cities or in the pockets of blackness, wherever blackness was located in different parts of, cities or in the US. I was thinking about that and thinking over time, these things do mainstream, and then the main audience may quite more than often can shift. And so I thought with this particular genre, the fact that these young people are doing it outside of the industry and doing it for themselves, and then there's all this technological change and the internet and all this sort of stuff. And as I was actually going through the process of studying and realizing how pivotal the internet was to kind of circumvent some aspects of censorship, I knew that it would cross over. And the fact that young people were doing these things on their own terms to begin with means that they don't really have to answer to anybody and they can just continue on. And through the internet, it expanded much, much further than anyone, I suppose, at the time may have imagined if you were outside the scene. So, there were scenes in Japan quite early on, the raving thing in the noughties, people would go to Ayia Napa, Cyprus. So people were starting to travel and move. So I thought this is going to, on its own terms, it's going to blow. I didn't know if the mainstream would fully get on board, but I knew that they had no choice. It couldn't be ignored, let's just put it that way. But the mainstream probably realised that, and so, they kind of got on board.
Yeah, it's kind of that perfect storm, really, wasn't it? Because like you said, it's something that could be just filmed on a video phone, chucked up on YouTube, and then you had a few channels on TV dealing with it, and it just kind of that perfect storm to blow up. Yeah,
exactly. And with technology becoming more democratized and just more accessible, it shifted the power dynamics of, creators, and then the internet facilitated the possibility to distribute stuff. As I was doing it, I knew I wanted to do the work to kind of push back against its demonization by the people in power. But as I was doing it, I realized all these different facets and thought, this is definitely going to blow and on its own terms. And technology was definitely influential in helping it expand and cross over to a much wider platform.
It's counterproductive when the media does this, isn't it? It's happened with so many youth cultures throughout generations. It happened with the rave scene, it happened with the punk scene. They just amplify it so people want to join it more, actually, rather than as a deterrent, don't they?
Yeah. I think the efforts to censorship, young people always have energy, always have creativity, always have something to say. And they will always find a way to say it. Like you said, with rave culture, back in the day, you might have had to put 10p in the phone box at the last minute to find out where this, warehouse or this rave was. But now, it's even easier. You can just, I suppose maybe not then, you couldn't send a WhatsApp, but the mechanisms through which people can now, disseminate information or share information and do things in their own terms is much more kind of sophisticated and nuanced. And so, when censorship's there, people always find a way.
Absolutely. And what was your methodology then, Monique? How were you actually collecting your information on the scene?
Okay, so it was a combination of three things. So it was interviews. So I interviewed people in the scene, and they were from different vantage points. So, a couple of artists, some events organizers, DJs, just people from different points in the scene. And then I did observations, so I had to go raving, as I mentioned before. So some of them were concerts, some of them were just gigs that people put on. And the other thing was a couple of songs I would listen to. I listened to lots of songs, but the songs that I gave most attention to were the songs that the people I interviewed kind of referenced the most often, and kind of analysed those and kind of made sense of those. And the combination of those three different kind of research methods, or those three approaches, kind of helped me to get a really good sense of the scene, whilst also developing a musical analytical framework that could give insight as to what grime is. But also it's gone beyond that now, because the punks quite like it. The academics that are studying punk quite like that, and have kind of used it to make sense of what is punk really saying in a sociological or cultural context? And so there are some other genres that have used it as well to try and make sense of what is happening. But those are the three methods that I use.
Was grime very much London centric when it first
Yes.
came out? I know we tend to think of sort of the South London area, Croydon area. Was that really the epicenter of where grime started?
Well, people have different takes, and I think the thing with I think the fact that it's crossed over is people, their histories may or may not have been revised to overestimate some places and underestimate other places. What I will say from what I've read with journalistic reports would always say East London was the place where it came from. Whilst I acknowledge that is one narrative, and I've had people say, no, it's from you. I know these people. I grew up in the area, so I know people who have said that. South Londoners always like to stand up and say, no, So Solid were the first. They weren't grime, but they were the ones that crossed it over towards grime. Yeah. So there is that. Whenever I say East London, South Londoners really want to stand up and be heard. So, and from my own research, from the people I interviewed, some of them have put the argument forward, and they were involved in they were South Londoners who were involved with working with East Londoners, key East Londoners that kind of, helped to create the scene. They said, one of the reasons why East London got that recognition is because Dizzy Rascal had the Mercury Prize in 2003. More Fire Crew had the single Oi that made it into Top of the Pops, top 10 single. So the main points where it crossed over, East Londoners kind of helped with that crossover. So that could be one of the reasons why. But many people I spoke to were definitely saying, So Solid, they are the guys that kind of really started this whole thing, even though their sound technically was not grime.
Yeah. Would that be more UK garage or tail end of the UK garage scene?
Yeah, it would be the tail end of the UK garage scene and kind of, it was kind of its own sound because it started to bring in kind of different sonic elements. Yeah, so but almost everybody that I interviewed definitely referenced them as the pioneers that really started to shake things up when it came to the British underground music scene. I suppose of the 21st century, because I don't want to disrespect any of the garage scene that was happening before, the jungle scene or any of the other scenes before, but the people, when I spoke about grime, the people I interviewed, they definitely, So Solid was definitely up there being referenced all the time.
But it's really interesting to say that, isn't it? Because actually those scenes you just mentioned, jungle into drum and bass, into UK garage, into grime, they're all coming out of the same places. They're all coming out of the same cities, the same street sounds.
Yeah, definitely. They're definitely coming from, the inner city spaces, where people can kind of live and create together. They are all very much connected. And you'll find that there are academics and journalists that have made attempts to try and kind of group those different genres together, giving them different names: hardcore, continuum, rhythm machine, bass culture. Lots of different people are giving that kind of family tree a name. Yeah. So yeah.
But it's very much a kind of UK sound, isn't it? I remember sort of early jungle playing it to an American friend. He was just like, what is this? And I know some of the grime artists have spoken to US hip hop artists, and it's just such a different, unique sound to elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a very, very unique sound. And I think for I say young people now, but for those people who were born at the turn of the millennium, to them this is normal. It's always been part of their, cultural or their sound, what makes sonic sense to them. It's always been there. But for us slightly older folk, it was something completely new. And it definitely represented the hidden places of, the inner cities. Back then we were kind of just coming out of the tail end of Cool Britannia and, the estates or the spaces where this music was made, the soundscapes, the things you would hear around you, the distorted sounds you would hear if you're standing on the top of a council block, or if you're, on the precinct with echoey sounds and, mopeds and all this sort of stuff. It was not necessarily familiar to the mainstream Britain that was often presented. So making music that kind of reflected some of these sonic characteristics was completely futuristic and completely alien to people that were not from these particular pockets of, I would say, hidden Britain.
So do you mind telling us a little bit more about your actual findings from interviewing and carrying out your observations? What were your kind of your main findings from the research?
Okay, there were many findings. I think my overarching question was "Hallowed be thy grime." So that was a remix on "Hallowed be thy name" for those who are Catholic or Christian, Our Father. So it was a remix of that, and so it was like, is it hallowed? And one of the reasons why I kind of asked that question was because of the condemnation and the really bad rap that grime had. And so my answer was yes and no. So grime was important for giving space to Black and working class men or young men. It was important in giving them space to kind of articulate themselves and be creative and do whatever it is that they do. It also kind of uncovered the fact that although, at that particular time, policy was targeting NEETs, so people not in employment, education or training, and they were deemed like, people that needed to be rescued by the government. Some people that fell into that NEET category were actually entrepreneurs on their own terms and creating careers for themselves, even if they weren't fully aware at the time that they were making careers for themselves. Some of them were. But, there was a whole hive of if you want to call it an alternative economy and things, productivity going on. It was a space for, I suppose, therapy. It was a space of catharsis for young people to kind of articulate their realities and express. It also showed, even though and this is not necessarily fully my area, but this whole thing about gangs and postcode wars and all that sort of stuff, when it came to the people that I interviewed, at least, they would travel from area to area to do clashes, camaraderie that went beyond postcode, went to different parts of London. People would travel to different parts of London, which was a different narrative that was being shown, as opposed to the mainstream narrative of it's all about postcode wars, it's all about gangs, and it's all about violence, and nothing is perfect, but it gave people a chance to kind of have some kind of camaraderie, some competitiveness, which can be traced back through the different genres you've mentioned before, also including dance or bashment. It was interesting. I also found when I was in live performance spaces, in many occasions, I was the only Black woman, especially it was a more underground scene. So it was male-dominated spaces, but where there were women, they were largely white women. So that was quite an interesting finding, which made me think, although, again, I didn't pursue this any further, it made me think that maybe these spaces, Black women may have thought, oh, this is something that the guys do. And so the Black women wouldn't necessarily go to these spaces. So that was quite an interesting dynamic that I came across. I mean, now, this may be completely different. I was doing this research in 2012, 2013, and it's definitely mainstreamed a lot more since then. It's crossed over and stayed over a lot more. Censorship helped to expand the scene. We kind of touched on that a bit earlier. The internet was a pivotal role in kind of enabling artists to kind of be seen, be known. The internet also enabled, I suppose, a more punk aesthetic to come back into play. So you could be really, really in close contact with, people that you're fans of. It wasn't the mega stars like up until that point before, at least in the mainstream, up until that point, you would find, an artist was not as in your reach. I mean, maybe for garage, I'm not so sure actually, but especially if you think about the US artists, the big artists that would blow up, they would be out of your reach, but people were much more in your reach from your area, speaking about the things that you could relate to. When it came to, I suppose, the spiritual side of things or the emotional side of things, it was definitely cathartic. The way that people spoke, if you want to talk about community languages, in quotations, the kind of ways that people spoke about music, whether or not they realized it, they were talking about life, they were talking about death, they were talking about madness, liminality, that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, there were lots and lots of interesting findings. One of the things, even though in my dissertation or my PhD, I made the case that young black, young, white working class men, largely at that particular time, they did need space. What I did find was that they were recreating hierarchies, and so in order to have a safe space, they would be they may be disrespectful to women, or may isolate or consider women beneath them, maybe if it's lyrically, or maybe if it's just that they're going to be doing the admin stuff or the less glamorous side of things. So there was that finding, although I still feel that young men still deserve a safe space. So yeah, there were just lots and lots of really, really interesting findings.
I was going to ask you about that in particular, Monique. You just kind of touched on it, but why do you think the grime scene is, in terms of the artists, predominantly male?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think it's reflective of the wider music industry, which is male-dominated. And then also, if we think about the study of girlhoods, is not particularly my area, but by and large, boys may be the ones that would be socializing outside a bit more, or maybe on road a bit more. And that might be a parental thing, boys might be allowed to go out more than girls. I'm not sure. But one thing that I do know, and it did kind of, I don't know, to be honest, I finished in 2016. I'm not sure if it necessarily played a full part in my analysis, but Trisha Rose speaks about the idea of, if somebody wants to learn how to, use turntables, if we bring it up to, grime at that time, CDJs or anything like that, a guy going to another guy's house to learn how to do that is a different dynamic to a girl going to do that. I mean, lots of when it comes to the music making, the technology side, it's like men seem to be a bit more gravitate towards that. Places where I've taught, production is largely men. And so if you wanted to learn any of those techniques, and especially as institutions were not necessarily teaching this as commonplace as they do now, young women going to find themselves in these kind of spaces to learn tricks of the trade, it wouldn't be as common. So I suppose there are many factors that I suppose I haven't fully unpacked or explored that are, I suppose, both push and pull that lead to be a group of guys making the music, running the pirate radio stations, making sounds that speak to them. Yeah.
And because in a similar sort of vein, as you said, predominantly the artists are black. How important is ethnicity to the scene?
I think it's very important. I think it's important because if we put on the MDA framework and we think about what music is, music is, especially if it's made by people outside of industry, it's people using the resources that they have available to them to articulate their reality. Now, if we think about, ASBOs were introduced in the tail end of the 1990s, that targets working class people, largely young working class men. And, if we keep breaking that down, black, young working class men are definitely, target or people that will be more likely to have an ASBO or be targeted for an ASBO. There are different kinds of, forces depending on your social coordinates that come into play. So finding a space, whether it's, and music is usually a really good space to kind of articulate your reality or express yourself if you don't have access to a lot of money, partly because it's already free. So, if you don't have expensive equipment, as long as you've got a working voice box, some hands and feet to make some percussive sounds, you can make music. Whereas if you want to do art, you're probably going to need paint, you're going to need brushes, you're going to need some startup costs. So music is this way to kind of articulate your reality, say what it is you want to say, and then it becomes a thing where if you're really good at some aspect of this, it gives you can kind of get respect from your peers in the process as well. It's a way that you can kind of generate an alternative, if you want to call it an alternative, I don't want to use the word hierarchy, but an alternative framework where you can get respect, where the larger system or larger society may not be giving you that. So I think it is really, really important that it comes from those spaces. And also another thing that I touched on in the dissertation was, in these working class areas, we're in Britain, we're not in the US, so it's not segregated. the blackest areas are still mixed. And so, you have white working class and, other, ethnicities in these areas, and they will be able to relate to some of these hardships as well, because they too are targeted, because whiteness in the British context, which is something that I uncovered. I don't know if you are familiar with Steve Garner's work, was really helpful here to kind of show middle class whiteness is the checkbox. But if you're not, then you might be Wayne or Waynetta Slob, or you're going to be a chav, which is really, you're kind of white, but you're not really. So there's still some kind of racial dynamic at play there. So for a group, whether it is all black or whether it is black and white working class and other ethnicities, that space to kind of create and share experiences, sometimes in terms of race, which is important, and sometimes in terms of class, and being able to use the resources you have available to speak about your reality, to create something and get respect for it and all that sort of stuff. It's really, really important.
That makes total sense, particularly the bit that you said about, you don't even need an instrument. This can be something that's done on a street corner. As long as you've got your voice, you've got a rhythm, you've got a beat to go by. In the same way that basketball or football is often seen as a street sport, I suppose it's kind of it's a street music, isn't it? Because it doesn't require the instruments or finance to go into it in the first place.
Yeah, and as it becomes more democratized, it's more accessible. So it's about the accessibility. I mean, I don't know when, obviously polyphonic ringtones, you could build your own track. Most people have a phone, PlayStation. Most people, that's cheaper than, studio time.
Yeah.
I don't know about paintbrushes. I mean, who's got £50? No, people aren't necessarily going to find £50 for paintbrushes. But if you've got £50 for a phone, and this is not necessarily the best economic unit to use, but £50 for a phone, okay, you can make music on it, you can make calls on it. It's multifunctional, so there's more scope for you to make music and use it in other ways. So it's a better buy.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you, Monique. Thank you. Can I ask you to give some more details if people want to read more about the study and your work in general?
Okay, so my website is drmoniquecharles.com. So just Dr. Monique, Monique, Charles as in Prince Charles, CHARLES.com. And on my publications page, you can find a link to my PhD that's already online. And I've got other journal articles online. So my MDA, how to make sense of music for the social sciences and the cultural studies field, is on there as well on the publications page. On my interactive page, I have a couple of YouTube videos that you can look at, me talking about how the scene spread, talking about, I can't remember some of the other things, race in the scene, a couple of other bits and pieces. So you can definitely check that out. And I'm on Instagram as well under Neake81. So that's Neake, so N for November, EAKE81. And yeah, that's how you can find me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Monique. I really, really appreciate it. And I enjoyed the interview. I learned a lot from that.
Oh, great.
Thank you, Monique. Take care.
No problem. Take care. Bye-bye.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.